respect in a modern treaty. Non-aggression pact, end to hostilities. But the important term up there is that Ramses the Great promises not to trespass on the land of the Hittites, to take anything from it. He's given up Kadesh. For years he fought to keep Kadesh. Why is he willing to give it up now? I think the answer may be in Exodus. Ramses had suffered his first defeat. He'd lost his firstborn son. This may have been more than he could bear. The Exodus and the death of his firstborn and other sons were not the only tragedies Ramses had to bear. Abu Simbel was completed around the 24th year of his reign, and he sailed up the Nile with Nefertari to dedicate their his and hers temples. No king of Egypt had ever built anything like it. Of all his wives, it was Nefertari alone who was his friend and companion. She had accompanied him everywhere and appears at his side in his temple statues. This was to be the last voyage for Nefertari, she for whom the sun doth shine. She died soon after their return to the Delta Palace. The Valley of the Queens was called the Place of Beauty, and there, Ramses built the most beautiful tomb in all of Egypt for Nefertari. His beloved queen is slender and elegant, ready to enter the next world. There she would take her rightful place with the gods. Ramses would reign for another 40 years without the companionship of Nefertari. From this time on, he was a changed man. Never again would he ride out of the Delta to lead the army in battle. His thoughts had turned from conquest to building tombs and monuments. With such a large family, hardly a year passed when Ramses didn't bury a son, a daughter, or a wife. To create the tombs for his family, Ramses employed an entire village of workmen, sculptors, painters, carvers, overseers, everyone needed to build a royal tomb. This is the town where they lived. It's the equivalent of a modern apartment house. 70 families lived here, right next to one another. Everybody knew everyone else's business. As a matter of fact, we know more about what went on in this village than we do about any other ancient city in Egypt. We still have the notes they wrote to each other on broken bits of pottery they used as scrap paper. This is Main Street. It's practically the only street. This was the house of Kaha. He was a big shot. He was overseer of the workmen. Come on in. This is the parlor. And over here, we've got his kitchen. And this is where the lady of the house ground the grain. Come on. Because he was so important, he had 2 sitting rooms. And back here, a real luxury, a column for holding up the roof. He had 3 bedrooms, and he needed every one of them. He had 8 kids. He was an important man. He was in charge of one of the gangs that worked on Ramses' tomb. There were 2 gangs that worked simultaneously, a left-hand gang and a right-hand gang. And our man Kaha, he was in charge of making sure that they worked efficiently. Everybody in this village had a specific job. Kaha's neighbor over here was a painter and a draftsman. Over here was Kawi. His title was Guardian of the Royal Tomb. He was in the security business. They all worked for Ramses. It was a tight-knit community. Because they lived near the Valley of the Kings, they were a bit cut off from the other villages. They were so far from the Nile that they needed a laundry service to wash their clothes. And they bartered their skills. I'll carve your coffin if you'll paint my tomb. That kind of thing. But the workmen didn't spend much time in the village. They had quite a trek to work, so they couldn't be daily commuters. You can still walk the path they took to work. Imagine them, walking in small groups of 3 or 4, carrying their tools, talking. It was a beautiful walk, and as they reached the top, they could see the whole of the Nile Valley below them. Beneath them, they could see Ramses' mortuary temple being built. I wonder if there was a competition between the two groups. Our tomb is better than your temple. Just over the ridge here is the Valley of the Kings. This is where Ramses hoped he would rest for eternity. After 67 years of an extraordinary reign, Ramses the Great died in his palace in the Delta. His body was taken to the embalmer's workshop, the same workshop that had mummified his beloved Nefertari, Amenhotep, his firstborn son, and so many of his sons and daughters. For 70 days, it remained there. Then the body was placed on a royal barge to make the long journey south to the Valley of the Kings. For 3 weeks, the ship bearing Ramses' body sailed upstream. The people of Egypt lined the shores to pay their last respects to the pharaoh who had ruled so well for nearly 3/4 of a century. As Ramses' mummy sailed southward, women of the towns threw sand on their heads and tore their clothing in the traditional sign of mourning. When the ship reached Thebes, it was met by the high priests of Amun on the east bank of the Nile. There, his mummy was placed on a ceremonial boat for its last journey across the Nile to the west, the realm of the dead. When the body reached the West Bank, it was transported on a sled to Ramses' funerary temple. There, priests recited the ancient prayers. Ramses was now ready to join the gods. Work on Ramses' tomb had begun 67 years ago. Now it was ready to receive Ramses' mummy. As in the tombs of the pharaohs before him, the stone sarcophagus was slowly lowered down a corridor, past the sacred texts on the walls that would speed the pharaoh on his way to the next world. The Book of the Gates, with all the passwords to overcome any obstacles. And most important, the Book of the Dead to assure resurrection in the next world. The corridor descended deep into the ground. Rooms had been carved, sculpted, smoothed, and then painted, so the king could show the gods how he should be treated, like one of them. Ramses' actual tomb has been the victim of both tomb robbers and severe flooding from the occasional downpour in the Valley of the Kings. But it's still worthy of Ramses the Great. The burial chamber is the largest in the Valley of the Kings and probably contained the greatest treasure ever assembled. Ramses had 67 years as king of the wealthiest country on earth to gather the gold and treasures he would take with him to the next world. This room undoubtedly held treasures far more spectacular than those of a young pharaoh like Tutankhamun. By the time Ramses died, most of the men who worked on the tomb were already dead. Ramses had reigned for 67 years. For most Egyptians, he was the only king they had ever known. When Ramses finally ascended to the gods, Egypt wept. But the mummy of Ramses did not remain in his tomb forever. Discovered by archaeologists in the last century, it was taken to Cairo. But this was not Ramses' final journey. In the 1970s, Egyptian curators discovered that the pharaohs in the Cairo Museum's mummy room were dying a second death. The humidity in the museum had allowed bacteria and fungi to attack the mummies for nearly a century. The mummy of Ramses the Great was sent to Paris to be studied and treated by a team of scientists. When Ramses arrived at the French airport, he received a full military reception as befitted a visiting head of state. Ramses' mummy was examined by a team of scientists at the Museum of Man in Paris. The X-ray of Ramses' skull shows teeth that are badly worn, decayed. There's a hole in the jaw caused by dental infection. An abscess around his teeth was serious enough to cause death by infection, a condition that Egyptian physicians had no way of treating. We can't be sure that this is what caused Ramses' death, but it's a good bet that the great man's last days were spent in agony. Many people don't realize it, but one of the most famous poems in the English language is about Ramses. Percy Shelley's Ozymandias describes a fallen statue of Ramses that once looked down on the funeral procession that brought the pharaoh's mummy to the mortuary temple.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed." And on the pedestal these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
Ramses died in pain, a crippled old man nearing 90. But the ancient Egyptians believed that in the next world you would be restored and young again. I like to think of Ramses somewhere in the west, riding out from the Delta Palace in his chariot, the army stretching for miles behind, setting off for new conquests. And when he returns, his beloved Nefertari is waiting to meet him with a couple of dozen of his kids. And as they gather round him, Ramses tells them of his victories and adventures. There were 11 kings of Egypt named Ramses, but there was only one, Ramses the Great.